Hello, and welcome to the Cash News Podcast. Informative conversations about all things currency and cash. We'll share insights on the issues affecting the world of cash today, like cash security, payments technology, and the cash supply chain. Your hosts, Meehan and Shaun Ferrari, hope to inform industry professionals and support better cash security and management by sharing the latest information on trends, strategies, and technology. This is the Cash News Podcast. Now, here's Tom and Shaun.
Oh, and we're back. Another episode of the Cash News Podcast. Shaun, I hear a barking dog. I don't know if anybody else heard
it. No, I don't know. It wasn't my dog this time, so I'm not sure where the barking dog is coming from.
It's coming in. I'm just hearing barking dogs. I don't think there's any barking dogs here, but there's always.
You never know. Well, hey everybody, good to be back. Good to be chatting with you. It's been a busy couple months and weeks. I don't know how long it's been. I'm losing track of time, but good to chat with everybody. Have you been traveling around the world, Tom, or the country anyway?
I have. Yeah. It's a little bit of world travel. It's been a busy. I don't know. The last few weeks have been crazy. I can't even really think of. Last week I was at Nashville. The week before I was in San Francisco. The week before that I was in Chicago. So it's pretty much every week somewhere. Next week I'm in Florida for something at UF, University of Florida, and then pretty much all the way till we're together every week I'm somewhere.
Yeah, it's that busy time of year. It's a fall conference season, so we just got back from London. We did 2 events over there. We thought maybe today we'd give you just a quick rundown of some of the themes that we heard in our London events. They were on digital currency and AI and central banking. So not much physical cash talk, although there was a bit of talk about how all the payment systems kind of fit together and how digital currency will circulate along with physical cash. So I mean, there were discussions on that, but the first event we did of the week last week was the Digital Currency Conference, and talk on that really centered around central bank digital currencies, stable coins, and digital assets, and kind of the trends, then kind of the regulatory aspects around them, and then what to expect from each of them in terms of use cases. Everybody really wants to kind of drill in and find the use case for all of these assets. I mean, it was an interesting discussion in the sense that central banks clearly still want to talk central bank digital currency, and finding the right use case for that, or the reasons for implementing one, if there are some, and some central banks have kind of leaned out a little bit, and are letting the market do their own thing, and others are continuing to lean in as a way to influence the market for central bank digital currencies. So it's a bit of a mix, I'd say, right now. A couple interesting takeaways on the CBDC front were that for the first time, our keynote address actually by the Bank of Israel talked about some reasons for doing central bank digital currencies that weren't some of the usual reasons, which was an interesting take on it. They were contemplating paying interest on central bank digital currency holdings, which isn't something usual that you hear the central banks open to doing. They typically think of CBDC as more cash-like, right? In that if you're holding it, it's like holding cash, so there is no interest paid. And if you start paying interest, you start disintermediating the market, right? And pushing the commercial banks out from. You're basically competing with deposit holdings, right? And their take was basically, yeah, exactly. We want to do that, and we want to have an incentive for people to hold CBDC. And if there is going to be an incentive, it would have to be an interest incentive to compete with commercial banks. And their thinking on that was a couple fold. One, it would incent people to actually hold the CBDC. Two, it would basically be a floor of interest rates that banks would more or less have to pay on a deposit account to again compete with the central bank rate of holding a CBDC. And then lastly, the thought was they wanted to incent people using it, the CBDC, as a way to get the private market to continue developing and deploying private solutions for digital currencies to compete with the central bank version. So, whether or not the long-term scenario still had the CBDC, I don't know, but they were really kind of looking at it, I think, as a way of kickstarting some development in the private market around the area. So it was just an interesting take. I don't know if they were really seriously considering a lot of those options, or if they were just throwing them out there as kind of provocative statements to get people thinking and talking. But it was interesting for sure. Different way of looking at it. That was the kind of the CBDC talk. I think the rest of, as I said, the other central banks and the suppliers and just the ecosystem that was there were really kind of all over the map between, do they want to continue developing? Should they start developing CBDCs? There were the few there that have issued CBDCs and talked about how that's gone. So I mean, we had a long discussion on use cases, and what are those use cases, and it's the typical discussions around those. So we don't have to go in those right now, but yeah, I think it was a good discussion. The industry, I'd say as a whole, has backed off of CBDCs a little bit, just in the sense that there's not a huge market, right? As I was saying, there's some central banks that are in, some central banks that are out, and it's a mix. So there are some vendors out there for sure that are still heavily engaged, and then there are others that are kind of pulling back a bit and waiting for that market to ripen a little bit. And that's where the other conversation came up, which was essentially on the private sector solutions, and especially kind of the digital asset space where they're working with commercial banks on developing digital asset holding solutions and trading solutions and those sorts of things. We had a really good discussion around the convergence of deposit tokens with CBDCs, which was kind of an interesting one where you have the big players, the big commercial bank players forming deposit tokens, but those are used in closed loops, right? I mean, it's used within an institution. So you have, for instance, Onyx with JP Morgan. Now, obviously, JP Morgan is huge, and it allows clearing and settlement on chain instantaneously for internal JP Morgan accounts. But if you want to go external to a different bank, you have a network problem, right? So the question was, is there a way to use things like CBDCs as the mechanism between banks, or as the mechanism cross-border, so that you can then leverage the internal commercial accounts, and it keeps the commercial players playing in the space that they typically play in with their customers and so forth. But then it provides a link, if you will, on-chain link between institutions, which there seems to be some coalescence around. If you're going to go down to CBDC space, maybe this is the area to do it. It's not quite customer facing; it's more bank to bank facing. It plays with the real time rails. It plays with things that are out there already connecting banks, but it could be another option, an on-chain option, as opposed to the normal clearing and settlement system.
Yeah. What was the overall? Sorry to interrupt. What was the overall kind of feeling on CBDCs? Were the folks that were engaged, or does it feel like it's kind of fizzled out, for lack of better words?
The folks that were engaged. It's just, I think it's a smaller group of folks that are engaged currently. I don't think it's necessarily a growing market, but it's those central banks that are exploring them, whether you're like Bank of Ghana or Kazakhstan, Bahamas, these banks that are engaged in them are very engaged and are trying to find something that works. And I mean, I think you take like folks like the Bank of England who are also looking at it and trying to find the use cases for it and figuring out what to do. So there's those that are kind of similarly heavy research, trying to figure out the right play with it. You got similarly with the digital euro. It's central banks taking a slow, measured approach. You have those that are the early movers, like as I said, the Bank of Ghana or Kazakhstan or Bahamas and those folks. And then you have those that are just kind of doing things quietly in the background and looking. So I'd say it's a again, those that are engaged, but it's not like you have 100 central banks around the world. You look at the trackers, and sure, it looks like if you look at the Atlantic Council's tracker, it looks like it's growing and growing and growing, and more people, more and more central banks are involved. I think the trick with that is, again, if you really parsed it, I think you would see a handful of really engaged banks, and then by and large, everybody else is kind of research and looking into it, and maybe a pilot here or there. I think the pilots it seems like the focus is kind of definitely more shifting now towards, again, kind of like a wholesale settlement, bank to bank, central bank to central bank, commercial bank to commercial bank, more in the clearing settlement area or cross-border money movement area than in retail, Tom and Shaun holding CBDC and using it. There are some, sure, but I think that's not the main.
Yeah, and I've always kind of felt like with CBDC is that the consumer or Shaun Tom holding it was the latter, right? Like this was really about bank to bank, and I guess maybe business to business, but I wasn't even thinking that yet, So I'm always very curious. It's a topic that I feel like there's a lot of misinformation, but I also feel like it ebbs and flows. Like there's like a lot of focus. There's an article written, and then boom, it's out in the open, and then it kind of slows and dwindles. And I would argue that you and I will probably be talking about it for a long time. I'm curious to where it's going, and I know a topic that I'm extremely passionate about and speak about regularly is artificial intelligence. I know there was talk in London about that. Was there anything that you heard there that was like an aha moment or something that you think the listeners would be interested in hearing about?
Yeah, I think, so we had the Central Bank AI conference following the digital currency conference, and that was 2 days of how central banks should think about or are thinking about using artificial intelligence. And I think really interesting discussions, and our agenda was quite broad, just in terms of all the different ways that central banks could be thinking about it. And I think the main takeaways I have from that event are that it's early for central banks in this space. As we know, they're the risk averse of the risk averse, right? So, to be able to implement safely and an AI system, it's complicated. It's especially when you're looking at using things like a Chat GPT type solution or a Copilot or whatever you want to use. But you can't open, as a central bank, right? You can't throw your data into an open system like that, or all of your work product into an open system and get it. So it has to be something that's safe and firewalled within your system and all that sort of stuff to be able to use it internally. So there's a lot of work at looking at some of the more public facing areas in terms of compiling information on supervisory reports that are submitted. So how do you help the supervisors take a lot of their supervisor information they have to go through and come up with summaries and different types of analysis. Of course, inherent in all that, and we had a lot of discussions on risks, is that, okay, well, there are a lot of still hallucinations, there's a lot of bias, there's all that sorts of stuff that you need to be really mindful of when you put that stuff together. So how to use it in a unbiased way, and how to supplement it with human experience and human thought, right, is key. So it was a lot of kind of preliminary discussions, and like with the CBDC discussion we just had, central banks are kind of all over the map with it. Some of them are more forward leaning, and have strategies together and teams together, and how they're going to look at it and how it's going to interplay with soup and reg, with their research, with interest rate policy, and all those things, and how they're going to use it and keep it safe. And then there's others that are kind of further just kind of thinking about it, right? In terms of, oh, well, we know it's out there. We need to learn from other central banks about how they're using it, and then we can start thinking about how to put it in. But they're just trying to figure out what's what so far. So I think it's definitely on the radar for everybody. It's how to use it in a meaningful and safe way is kind of what's being contemplated right now in the central bank world. There's also just the concern. I think there's a lot of concern on privacy. I mean, it's the same thing in the digital currency and in the AI space. Really, it's that privacy argument of, okay, how do I, if once AI starts to be used on my personal data, what does that really mean? What does that do, and how do I keep it private? So there's that.
Yeah, I mean
discussion
that's kind of what I've been talking about a lot. Is all of the things you've talked about is things I talk about. The one that I always kind of immediately talk through is the bias piece of the models are biased because we're biased, and that's why the models are biased. The data that they're using in every fashion, as long as we've been, I should say, modern AI has been out, and I'm not referring to the chat GPT or generative. I mean, I consistently, push back on that. AI is not new, and biases are driven by people who write models or data that's biased. So bad data always creates that. I think the hallucination thing is an interesting conversation to have, because I think that specifically with Gen AI, you'll see some really big advancements of hallucination. I don't think we'll get past some of these true black box events where there's not really an explanation for it. I think that's one of the things that we may not see. I know that just 2 weeks ago, when ChatGPT did their newest model, the news picked up, and this is an accurate thing, that there's a moderate risk. Moderate's a pretty strong word, I think, too, of someone using it to make chemical weapons. So like, as the model gets better, they're going like, how do we balance that use case piece? And then as privacy goes, I think this is and this conversation will never end, is I guess it depends what you mean by AI, because machine learning has been around for a long time, and gosh, I don't remember quite when, but it's been at least 15 years that every credit card transaction goes through a machine learning AI to look at what the risk is. And the way that works is by capturing data to see what fraud is and what's not. So today, if you and I pick up our smartphones, the second we start to type, there's a model that identifies that, and depending on what type of phone you have, it collects more data or less data to see that. I mean, there were models, again, I'm dating these, some of these are years ago, where how quickly you typed on your screen had a relevance of whether it was fraud or not. Like, I mean, so that stuff's been on forever. I think privacy is a risk, but I'm not sure it's more of a risk because of AI. That's the the largest personal data breach. Virtually every single person's social security number was involved in a breach just a few months ago. And then if you go back to Equifax, I remind everybody that it already happened. So it's the second time it happened. So the speed in which you can do damage is probably more of a concern, but it's definitely a topic that I think for currency research and your full is not going to go away. I actually think you're probably in the next 6 to 8 months going to see a much broader conversation. I still think today some of the central banks and some of the bigger banks are going like, yeah, we don't use ChatGPT like Chase, and so that's the kind of the Gen AI piece, not the future of voice assistants. Uh, I would be lying. One of the big three consulting firms said that 97% of customer service will be AI, supported or driven, in the next 3 years. And I'm seeing this massive adoption of these really advanced chatbots and these really advanced these that didn't exist before. So it's going to be interesting for us for sure.
Yeah, no, that is true, and I think somebody made the comment last week. And it's again, it's nothing that we don't already know, but just to kind of hear it stated was right. It was like, to your point on chatbots, it was like people are always like, "Oh my God, we're gonna have more chatbots, and how horrible is that? I won't be able to talk to anybody." And it's like, it's you have to remember, it's by and large, it's not that we actually want to talk to somebody. It's that we want to resolve our problem. Um, and the chatbots were just so horrible before that's what we hated. If the chatbot was effective,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And
you wouldn't hate it.
I'm trying to find. So I do this presentation. I was trying to find a video of like, someone talking, and be like, operator, and it's like two, like it just goes like the old chatbots, that old not listening. That's kind of gone away. Whether or not you've seen the adoption, I mean, what you can do with voice today is near perfect, and you can have a chatbot, which you'll probably hear things like enhanced voice assistant and things like that coming very very soon. That can take a model and actually use some sort of reasoning to say, okay, if Shaun Ferrari said this, um, this is probably what he means, and then ask and get back and forth. And I agree with you. I tell people all the time, my aversion to using some automated services is because I feel like at times it could be slower. But I'll use Amazon as an example. Like, I I don't know that I've ever spoken to anybody at Amazon live, and their new approach is they'll get you to the point where if you need someone, you're on a chat with somebody. You don't even know if it's a real person, but it solves the issue. And that's kind of the key to your point, is like, as long as it gets fixed, like, I don't necessarily care. um, I think there's definitely a need for human interaction, but I think if you hear some of these intelligent voice assistants that I've seen that are going out, like, maybe you could tell, but you only could tell because you think it's something. And if you haven't tried even like using OpenAI or ChatGPT, their newest voice assistant is available for everybody now, which has no pauses, very natural language. You can interrupt, like you can stop your question midstream, and it it's pretty good. It's actually a little bit eerie sometimes because it if you use it often, it remembers what you did yesterday, and it'll reference something like, "Are you talking about this?" And I'll leave. This will be my last statement. I did a presentation in, gosh, where was I? I was in Louisville, Kentucky, and the night before the presentation, I was sitting. Um, we had a little cocktail gathering, and I said, "Hey, I'm going to try this tomorrow. Let's test it." And we did a live. We used ChatGPT, and we were talking at the table. And there's a gentleman across from me named Dave Thompson, and he's like the world-renowned expert on interview and interrogation. And the next day, when I fired the chatbot up, it said, "Is Dave Thompson here? I'd like to say hello to him." Had a good conversation, and then it went on to say that there was someone that used the word snarky in the conversation. So not only did it have a conversation, but like it actually recited and said good morning, and that's a real use case without being told to do that. Now, I would argue that if you were on the phone and it said, "Hey, I noticed, hey, I was looking at the notes you called yesterday. This is what you'd say." This is what it did in actual real time in front of an audience of 350 people, and said, "I enjoyed our conversation." It said what we were eating. Like it remembered everything and like went through. And although I stopped it because I was in front of a large audience, It didn't say anything bad, but when it said that someone was snarky at the table, I'm like, maybe I should stop this. I don't know where this is going, but I really wish I didn't, because it basically recapped the conversation in human-like form, like, in really human-like form. So I see that coming, and I see that in the banking world being heavily adopted. I mean, who doesn't want to get their answer solved? Who doesn't want to be able to go, like, can you look at the notes? Like, this is the fourth time I've called. Like, no one wants to have that conversation. Although I think I shared this. If I didn't, I apologize if I did. But my local Chase, which has never had a teller, in since I had bought this house, now has tellers again. They put back tellers, and it's pretty wild. This is like the training of the human behavior. I'd go in, and they have the big ATM, I guess you call it, that could do everything. And then every time someone would come out and talk to me about wealth management, and my kids would be like, why don't they help us? Like, they're trying to sell stuff. Now we go in the bank. When my son and I went in this weekend, and yes, I still go to the bank pretty regularly, actually. And I went to the bank and go to the ATM, and the teller, they cut a hole in the wall. They put like an official, back to the old days. And there's two ladies sitting there, and they're like, oh, can we help you? And the behavior, they changed my behavior. Like, I don't even, like, I go right to this big giant machine and do everything there. And it's not your typical ATM. It doesn't have the restrictions. It's got, you can, I guess, put a bazillion checks in if you needed to. But it was funny. My son said, well, what do they do? Like, why are they here? Are they trying to sell stuff? And I said, that's the way it used to be. And what AI will do is the same thing. I mean, I went to that bank. There was no tellers. So my behavior changed and how I banked what I needed. I think we're going to see that evolution with AI in banking, where people are just come accustomed to, like, this isn't a real person, but it solves my issue. So we'll get it, we'll get it done. So yeah, very interesting. So where,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay,
No,
what were you say?
It was. Yeah. No, I was going to say, yeah, I think you were about to go with where are we next, what's going on. And I think, yeah, we're coming up about a month away, a little over a month from our New Orleans event, which is the Americas Cash Cycle and Payment Seminar. So we're looking forward to that. Tom, you and I will be in person, both there. So that's exciting. And that agenda, we're putting the final tweaks on it now, but essentially, like usual, that one's pretty cash heavy. So we're going to be focused on regional trends in cash and payments, and how that's changing in the Americas, and different technologies for handling and processing and moving cash. And we're not going to shy away from topics like digital currency and AI as well. So it should be a fairly expansive agenda, a couple days. Actually, it's going to be over the election night while we're there, so that will be interesting.
I didn't realize that.
Should create interesting conversations. Yeah. So yeah, be some watch parties going on.
Wow,
it should be fun.
I feel like I should know that. Didn't know that. That's going to be as usual.
So if you are coming to the Americas event, make sure you early vote, or do what you need to do.
We're gonna have to have a watch party, right? Is there going to be like a whole on?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. All right. Well, that's where I'll be. I'll be during the election. I'll be in New Orleans with Shaun. I think we'll have some control tech presence there, so it's exciting. I'm looking forward to it. It's one of my favorite events that I go to every year. So you guys, you do a great job with the content, and it's a good crowd. So aside from it being election, which we'll have to think through, I think it's going to be an awesome event, and hopefully the weather holds up well.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Well, good. Well, we will chat again soon. I know you've got to jump, and I've got to go do some stuff too. So good to talk to everybody.
Yeah.
We'll talk soon.
Good to see you.
Thanks for listening to the Cash News Podcast. We hope you found this episode insightful. Don't forget to like and review us on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and be sure to visit us at thecashnews.com to stay up to date with the latest on the world of cash. Thanks again for listening to the Cash News Podcast.